we use card now, people are used to saying getting OTP even for bank transaction. So when something you introduce new as a payment method, to get mass adoption it takes some time, but once it is adopted and becomes a common method, then you can build upon that, and you don't want to ask many different ways to do. Today I see some glitch in UPI. It is not a single threaded transaction, right? You have a merchant, you want to pay through UPI, but then it waits for some time. You have to go to the UPI tab and basically submit the payment. Sometimes because of the network glitches it doesn't work, so it is a friction, and also it is not a very seamless user experience that might deviate people from using it. Wallets were initially there and then people were using, but then the KYC mandate also made some people go away from that, right? So those are glitches that we have to see how in nationwide we can have a platform for payments which is very very easily usable at fingertips, which is our mobile today, and how we can have a very consistent user experience. Then we can come back to the security. Now of course I want to touch base on little bit on the security frictionless authentication we talked about, right? We all understand that we are in the fintech as in is your financial data, it is your card holder data, it is a very sensitive, we call it PII information, right? Personal identifier information. We do not want that information to be leaked or hacked or breached in any way. So how do we do that? Even with this, is there a way? Is the solution is to ask for multi-factor authentication all the time? Maybe that's not user friendly. If you keep asking me multiple factors, I probably lose track of that and the time goes, right? And suddenly you have to start all over. Those are the experience we have seen. So how can we make our technology more automated? Because there is no dearth of latest technologies that we use today. So I think we are looking at, and I think from the world of cybersecurity, I can say we look at latest patterns for machine learning and AI to automatically detect system anomalies. When end user or consumer enters his credentials or data, how do system detects the device fingerprint, the keystrokes that the person does, how fast he types, is client credentials and client blueprint, and how do we automatically collect as a behavioral data, and how do we analyze that is a behavioral analytics we do? How do we collect the biometric automatically? You don't have to actually specifically make effort of it. So system automatically connects all of these factors, and if that raises the risk, like suppose I'm logging in right now from India and in an hour I log in the different IP address from US, it's definitely a geographical alert that I have, right? One of the factor in behavioral analytics. So how do I raise the risk? Only when you raise the risk, of course you can ask for a second factor, because we don't want to compromise your hard-earned financial data to be lost and the money behind it, right? I think that's about it. There is something new came up recently, something called safe click checkout. So transactions which are under 3,000 rupees, we do a network authentication. So these are newer ways that we started implementing, right? It's a network level authentication. You don't have to ask a second factor, even OTP, which is mandated by our financial institution. So you just do network level authentication, because that is a contract between the issuer and the acquirer and the merchant, that this is a limit and this is a high value end user or a consumer. He definitely has that much money, even if he's not able to pay around say 3,000 or 5,000 per transaction. There is a cap, there is a reserved quota for that particular high value consumer, and with that transaction we don't ask any extra factor or no authentication. It's a network level authentication. It's a safe click checkout that we saw. So there are newer ways we come up with, but it should give a seamless experience to user. It cannot be complex, because a mass population in India, rural India, where there is no it's a literacy factor, financial literacy, I would say. It's not the normal literacy. Financial literacy is not penetrated that much that people would understand what is the information I'm giving. Is this identity theft? It is my financial information. How do I do my payment? That's why they go back to again cash, because it's very easy for them to understand. One paper given, one paper retrieved, right? It's very easy. So I think we should look at all of these factors, and I think probably I'll touch base on security aspects little later when we go around the table, but those are my thoughts around it.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm going to come back to you and Monica on a number of these things. I think one thing that we've all spoken about is the complexity. So, Renuka, let me take this to you. I mean, we clearly have increasing complexity. we are there is a hope for interoperability. The RBI mandated interoperability for the wallets, and that was done through UPI, etc. Now we're talking of newer platforms. We're talking of the NUEs. So you're going to have maybe somebody coming in on one app on UPI to a gateway, and then going out to somebody else. And so how do you for the user, if there's a failure or he pays, he's debited. The merchant says, I didn't get it. Merchant says, you pay me again. Where's the accountability? Where's the how do you ensure that so that there is trust? And what are your thoughts on the things we can?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here. I'll respond to that and a couple of other things that I heard my co-panelists say. So the word that I heard underlying what everyone was saying was this question of trust and how do you get consumers to use some of these products. I think that one thing that's very important is what is the regulatory framework that you have at the back end, so that for the customer it's a frictionless experience. And this regulatory framework has to be at multiple levels, right? So it has to be at the time of onboarding, and that's where things like KYC regulations are important, and what is the friction the consumer faces when he or she is trying to sign up to one of these apps or to make some sort of a transaction. There is regulatory framework around the time the transaction happens, and that sort of speaks to what you said, Prashanto, about if things go wrong, who is responsible. And one way the regulatory framework can deal with this is how we are dealing with it today largely, which is to mandate XYZ things, where the regulator seems to be taking a decision on what is it that will lead us to security or what is it that will lead us to ease of transactions. But the other way, it's not that the regulator hasn't done this, but I think we need to investigate this a little further, which is how do you build liability frameworks so that when transactions happen different between the different players, you have a card issuer, you have a network, you have a payment aggregator, then there is a payment gateway. Now as a consumer, I don't see all of this, and if something goes wrong, it's important to figure out where in the chain did things go wrong and how do you apportion liability to various providers. And if you do that right, then what you're doing is incentivizing the businesses themselves to take care of some of these things and put in their own checks instead of by diktat saying that you have to do XYZ things. So I think that's one area that requires significant amount of work, as more and more players and platforms and users who are not particularly financially literate start accessing the system. And finally, I think that the other place where regulation needs to play a very important role is when things go wrong for the customer. So it's one thing to apportion liability and you solve that problem between the players, and maybe the consumer gets her money back, but there have to be better grievance redress procedures, so that you again have regulations around the grievance redress procedures, so that the players, the businesses, are incentivized to have these GRMs, so that they can solve consumer problems and it doesn't have to go to an ombudsman. So I think that a system where you have to keep going to an ombudsman is just inefficient. What you again need to do is to incentivize the businesses to solve the problems when they arise, because the businesses should be scared that the consumer is going to the ombudsman. So I think that, if I had to summarize what I said, I would say that we need better and more streamlined regulation on KYC so that the process is smoother. We need better liability framework so that we don't do micromanagement of how security standards should be applied. I think businesses are better equipped to figure out how to deal with the risks, and when they have a liability, they'll make their decisions. And you of course need better grievance redress procedures so that they are incentivized to service the consumer as and when the problem happens. I think if we get this back end right, then some of the issues that the other panelists also spoke about, which I agree with them on, is to how do you onboard more consumers and get them to use digital services. I think those will become easier and frictionless.
Terrific. Okay, so that's a wide range of things, and I'm going to get back to you on some of these, including the KYC issues, the regulatory framework, the liability. So let's stay on this thread of the from the liability, the complexity. So complexity clearly, I mean, that's given in terms of at least number of systems. We're going to have more payment systems. Okay, we are going to have the NUEs. There may be one more UPI or another second or a third. So there may be two or three competitors to UPI. So I think one question I'd like to put to all of you, maybe starting with Monica, is that is interoperability something that we really push for? We've had, I mean, there is some limited success there. Interoperability, for example, has been mandated in yeah, through UPI in the PPIs, mobile wallets. Mobile wallets now you earlier you went to a shop, would have a QR code for ATM and one for MobiQuick, one for Oxygen or something or the other. Now it's one QR, and if it is a Beam QR, Bharat QR, whatever, that is one way, or the others who use UPI to make sure that the basically use that QR code. But how will it work when you have multiple platforms? For example, you don't really have interoperability in that same way between cards and the PPIs at this point in time. Given the thing on accountability also that Renuka said, it's fairly complex. So do you think interoperability across diverse payment systems is something to aspire to? Also, I'll throw one more thing into the mix. Multiple people have asked for light touch regulatory environment. The Wattle committee said light touch, etc. So we don't want overwhelming regulation from RBI, which is going to manage. And in the sense, it's been pretty good in that sense because if you take the TPAP setup, they say we don't regulate the TPAPs, we regulate UPI. And it's up to NPCI to figure out if the TPAPs are complying or not. So that's one good way to do it. And you could argue that. What do you think works on the interoperability? How much interoperability should we aim for so that anyone using any payment system should be able to pay to pretty much any merchant? Monica, thoughts on this?
So, Prasanta, it would be a utopian world if we could have that in reality. And I'm sure we'll probably head there at some point in time. But I'm not sure that that's actually required because a person using a card may possibly be using it for very different purposes than a person using a digital wallet. And somewhere the obfuscation has actually happened with the large big tech players like Google, Apple, Samsung actually coming in, which by creating an OEM to actually be the holder of a card transaction or of a card, therefore having a card resident on a mobile and making that be the form factor with which you make a payment. So the same goes for wearables as well. As we all move towards more digitization, I think that is one space which is called connected devices, which is expected to grow. So when we talk about interoperability, I really don't think that the user as a consumer, I and you, would care about whether there are systems that are interoperable or not. I just care about making a payment and getting done with it. For me, the confusion arises when I don't know where the accountability lies. And the perfect example which you also brought up, which is about what the Wattle committee also recommended, which is about light touch regulations, is because we have so many players in the mix, where does accountability lie? So, for example, a bank normally owns the card instrument because it is the issuer of a card, and a network actually provides a network authorization, settlement, and clearing cycles. So, it is responsible for making sure that that part of a transaction actually goes through. But it is actually the eventual wallet holder or the wallet provider that is responsible and is interacting with the customer daily. So, when there are issues, the customer normally tends to reach out to the wallet provider, but the wallet provider has absolutely no control over the transaction because it neither controls the customer and the data, and neither does it even understand the transaction because it is basically acting as a pass through. Now this is important. Now as payment professionals we understand this, but as a user, when you are the recipient of a failed transaction, you do not understand this and you shouldn't have to. It's that is when the RBI steps in. And Renuka talked about the ombudsman. There have been cases where for a 5 rupee transaction an ombudsman has been put in and stepped in only because there has been mistrust in the system. I think those are the issues that we have to solve, because when a TPAP comes in or a third party application comes in, it has to be regulated or at least follow the compliance guidelines. Therefore, the customer support and handling has to be something that must be managed, because once a customer loses trust in the system, then I think there is never going to be a returning customer. And also on the other side, it is for each one of us in the ecosystem to therefore provide and open ourselves up to be able to expose certain pieces that are critical for customer handling and support. And we tend not to do that because financial transactions and support data is also very, very private and has to be maintained with the highest degree of security. But the question is, in these kind of scenarios where we are now having layers over layers of over black boxes, which are actually the ones that actually make transactions move and payments happen, how do you manage the trust which normally belongs to a customer dealing with a player who is many, many layers above the actual black box dealing with the transaction? And I think that is where the complexity is increasing. And this is where data, privacy, security, and anything associated with customer trust gets entangled. And that's where we are at.
Okay, terrific. I think interesting perspectives there, Mridula. I'm wondering if you agree on some of them. So this thing of interoperability being utopian in a sense. So I think one way to look at it is, I mean, note the UPI example which we gave, that's one. But I think one other way of getting interoperability sort of implemented is at the acceptance point. Today, increasingly at merchants, if you go to POSs, the modern POSs can accept a wide range of payments. So it's not just cards. They can generate a dynamic QR on the screen, and you pay using a wallet app, TAP or whatever it is. You can of course use contactless. You can use a phone which has tokenized, whatever. So maybe that's one way of doing it. In your view, has interoperability worked very well anywhere else, or are we in new territory and it's kind of working pretty okay the way it is in India? How would you go about implementing interoperability across such diverse range of systems?
Yeah, so Prasanto, I think a good perspective. I think I like the way Monica has put together. So for us, right, we should not just blindly take the definition of interoperability in this space. Interoperability here means, as you just mentioned that word acceptance, and we are coming to that, right? Earlier, if I had Paytm, I had to scan a different type of QR code, and Google Pay, I have to scan a different QR code. So at the point of acceptance, whether it is at merchant acquirer, right, at that place, if that interoperability is implemented as in one consistent interface to accept payments with one kind of wallet, maybe I have a wallet, maybe I have a UPI, but for consumer, do not expect and do not overburden a consumer to install many different applications, many different wallets and UPI system for me to do my day-to-day transaction, a seamless payment. If you want me to be digital, right? If I have a GPay, or if I have a particular UPI or mobile wallet, it should be enough for any acquirer or merchant to accept my payment. So acceptance side, if you do that interoperability to accept one interface, and doesn't matter behind the scene that interface or that QR code which actually results into a server URL, whether that is accepted by a GPay based system, UPI based system, mobile wallet based system, or debit card based system, whatever that we come up with, or any tap pay, right? So that is where I think interoperability makes sense for us. As we say, right, behind the covers, consumer doesn't understand or doesn't need to understand what technology is being used, whether there is a interface, a technological interface being maintained between different banks together, or different country specific, whether RBI or Bank of England, or we don't care, right? How do you maintain the interfaces? How do you make it interoperable? That is up to you. But as long as me as a consumer comes to do a transaction at the merchant, I want to do a get services or get goods. If I'm able to pay with one wallet or one UPI or one debit card that I have, I think that acceptance makes sense to me. I call it as interoperable, right? I think that's where the crux of things stand from the consumer perspective. One more point I wanted to make on that accountability perspective, right? I think now we have to be, even now we are getting digital, it has to be global digital. It cannot be just country specific digital, which I think. And this RACI that we call, right, responsibility, accountability, all this concept and all this means that we have to see how globally it can be same, because today's consumer is a global consumer. People travel. If I travel from India to US, I get into completely different system there, right? In US, people still use heavy transaction on debit card. They don't use UPI as much as Asian country APAC uses today. And the liability is also different. If you go to US, at the banks and the because they don't mandate second factor authentication. So that means the liability ownership is mainly taken by banks. They actually reserve good amount of money for everybody's security for transaction, so they take a lot of ownership and liability. But if you come to India, if you come to APAC, because the regulation is there to have a second factor by default for OTP for any transaction you do, whether it's online banking or card payment or anything, I think the liability transfer, it shifts from issuer or banking system or financial institutions to a consumer, and consumer has no information whether the card issued by bank I should talk to, or the network provider, or the payment network is somebody I have to resolve my issues with. And that's where I think the confusion is, and the liabilities differences, I think we should get to a point where it becomes very generic, very one system and very one policy for all. Otherwise, if I go to US, I'm free, right? I don't care. I just happily do transaction. Nobody's asking me OTP. If I come to APAC, there is so much restriction because I know the liability is with me. And that is a good point I think we discuss in between. I think Renuka mentioned that when we talk about liability and accountability, if you give it to the parties involved in between, they automatically take care of security. Because if I'm responsible for something, if something happens as a fraud or breach, if I'm supposed to pay out, I will better make sure of there are the checks and balances done in terms of security protocols. So those are the things I would connect to all of these points.
Okay, great points there. I'm going to take up some of them. On the globally digital, and earlier you mentioned the AIML frameworks, which are being used in global models and to quickly learn envelopes of fraud. How challenging is that in an increasingly balkanized world where there uh, hands of data centralization. But I want to take that up if we have time, because I just want to take this question to Renuka, that in terms of the liability framework. Now, one thing we heard about was this globally digital, increasingly complex payment systems where there may be global. You may have payment gateways which are global. You may have, how does that fit there? Second is there something that you've seen working well? So one example is with cards. Okay, it seems to be fairly clear that the user believes that there is liability with the issuer, or at least if there is a issue, or if there's a hack or the card is lost, they know who to call. They call, I don't know, Citibank or Bank, whoever issued. Fairly straightforward. But now, increasingly, with the various digital payment systems, you may have multiple parties involved, not just in the payment. I mean, for example, my driver, he started digital payment. He took up a mobile wallet, most popular market, and he got hacked. So he got payments being made from that mobile wallet. Then he found that the mobile wallet was getting automatically charged by his from his bank account. Okay, and that bank account, he had not set it up for an automatic recharge. There should have been an OTP. Somehow that got, now he has lost trust in the system and he said, I'm not going to use it. And here clearly you don't have a single point of liability, no single issuer, because there is a connected bank which is saying we have nothing to do with this. You have set it up. What do you think works?
So I think that the example that Mrudul gave about how you don't have two-factor authentication in the US and payments go so smoothly is an example of what works. So I love doing transactions there because I don't have to worry about this OTP business, the way that I have to worry about in India. And I think that again, like she mentioned, the banks and card issuers have figured this out themselves, and you will have different risk management systems based on where the transaction is happening. So if the transaction is happening in, say, a building where you know that the crowd is, for example, homogeneous, where you know that the crowd typically, so let's say it's an office quarter, or there's a Starbucks on the ground floor in BKC, the kind of transactions, the security systems that you might place in for transactions that come through that IP will be different from that come through another IP. And hence I think that this is an example in the US where liability frameworks actually work. It does get complicated when you have multiple players, but perhaps one way to solve that is for these different players, or for the bank to get into contractual agreements with the different players, because ultimately they are linking to the card issuing bank, or they are linking to the bank where the account sits. In which case, if you can get into contractual agreements like that, such that when something goes wrong, these contractual agreements come into play, and then the liability gets decided. Then the onus is again on the service providers to solve their risk management and security systems, and not on the user to make sure that there is an OTP each time. So I think that the OTP system is incredibly inefficient. You are making me waste my time on this, every 500,000 rupee transaction that you do. If for some people this amount is huge, fine, you have it optional. But to mandate these kind of security measures, I think is inefficient. It's painful for the consumer, and we need to have these kind of contractual agreements and liability frameworks that will solve the problem. You can also solve the problem through GRMs, right? So you have grievance redress measures, whereby if this framework doesn't work and the regulator is then able to pinpoint blame, you figure out how you will apportion these things. In large infrastructure projects, for example, we know that different service providers come into a contractual agreement saying that if the fault is below a certain amount, this is how we will apportion the money across each other, because it's just cheaper to do that than to go investigating where the fault arose each time. So I don't claim to know all the models through which this can be done. I think it's for the businesses to figure out how this can be done, and for the regulator to facilitate these kinds of measures, so that we don't do this, these extremely micromanaging regulatory interventions, such as OTP for every 10 rupee transaction, and such as not having cards stored, so that if you had to go through Amazon, Netflix, now of course that deadline has been postponed, but I think again those measures are coming into place because we are doing micromanagement and not having better liability frameworks to solve the problem. I can't hear you, Prashant. I think you
I'm
dropped.
sorry, so sorry.
Yeah.
The card on file issue really has been, almost a nightmare for a lot of thing, and they pushed it out. But they really should have looked straight away at things like organization and so on. On the other hand, they have listened in on certain things. I mean, for example, standing in the directional factors being waived in intervening is, of course, a time issue, and so the deadline, and again, that got pushed out. Or, uh, contactless, for example, where limit now, but it's not actually been it's not been implemented very smoothly. But I want to just quickly, we have about 5 minutes, so I want to just take up a few questions. So we have N Gupta who's asking, when are we going to get rid of link failure in banking connectivity? So Digital India depends very heavily on connectivity, and we do have connectivity challenges, even though some of us, but many of us do, and in smaller towns, is then there are internet lockdowns. There are entire states like which have not had proper connectivity uh, on wire. So what's the answer? So one thing which is being experimented with is offline payments in various ways. So very low value transactions which can be, and there are some RBI projects in sandbox that do that. Any thoughts on this? How do you handle this entire when you have the entire population being pushed in one direction?
I think mobile wallets is one thing where there is a sufficient amount of money that is held offline. That could be one way where you don't need to transact online. I think those are few things. Even on the card payments, all the digital networks are coming up with the solution where if there is a drop in the network or connectivity, as I said, right, it's between the issuer and the merchant. There is a contractual agreement saying that this particular customer, based on his identity, identified as a value customer. You don't need to basically immediately check on authorization and settlement or clearing for that person. You can use the bank you reserved fund to use that could be made offline. So there are many ways coming right now, because people do understand these nuances and the sticky points where internet connectivity and network can drop. So I think those things can help, as far as I can say.
Any thoughts, Monica, Renuka? How do you handle, digital India with the internet?
I actually think that the government has been doing a fine job of looking at what the issues are and looking at a little bit of a carrot and stick approach. But I think there need to be stronger and stricter guidelines in terms of trust and performance. And if performance guidelines are not met, then there has to be resilience that is built in. And therefore, the ability to be able to also monitor what these performance parameters are and penalize the associated parties accordingly. Having data systems that people are able to switch off because they were trying to vacuum. You've heard of this very famous story where somebody was trying to vacuum in a particular bank and they basically turned the entire system off and card transactions started failing. Now, that is something that we can't live with, not in digital India. And this happens all over the world, by the way. This is not about being in India. The important thing is to therefore have the ability to have resilience built into the point that when there is failure, there are other redundancies that are built into the system, and then we don't have these outages. And when there is an outage, then customers are informed about the outage because everybody understands we are all human. Not being informed and therefore then being left to left just like on the last days of typically your income tax filing, etc., and left to the last day, being in that rut, I don't think that is something that is acceptable to any society.
Okay, so we are running out of time. 2 3 minutes left. We do have a number of. I think some of them are observations. Security and convenience go hand in hand. That's from Anil Chiplankar. Regulators act in the best interest of consumers, and more so from the perspective of securing. We've seen in the past that sometimes regulations may be heavy-handed or they may appear to actually align with incumbent and players, etc. But I think we have seen the RBI, reasonably open to newer platforms and so on, because there's a lot more things which have been recommended in the other coming. So, okay, so I want to, I think we have a minute to go. I just want to give each of you just a last what to see as the biggest challenge going forward, say, as we step into multiple new payment systems, and we want to get all. Like you mentioned, the date. Uh, Absolutely right. I mean, hundreds of millions of those are simply putting the money in the account and at the most they're taking it out of the ATM. We're not able to get them to inspire. So, what is the challenge that you see in seeing transactions ramping up in this? Is it, Renuka, I'll start with you. So, you already said liability framework is one very big. Do you see that being addressed or being considered?
I know. I think we are some distance away from that, though. I hope that discussions like these take that forward. The other thing that I would say is that we need to rationalize our KYC procedures, and I see we have 13 seconds left. So I am going to stop here and say better cost benefit analysis before we put out regulations and let my other panelists speak.
Thanks so much, Renuka. Monica?
I think we need the ability to be able to trust our users with being able to do their best, but we first need to empower them with the right education and invest in infrastructure rather than trying to subsidize cost of transactions.
Okay, great points there. Again, one could get into a new panel on that, whether you can actually trust the billion users, leave it to, yeah, but we'll have to take that in another panel. Mridul.
Yeah, just I think I agree with Renuka and Monica. I just want to close with the comment on cybersecurity policy because cyber breaches affect public and private assets without making any distinction, right? That is something we have to understand. There is nothing public, nothing private, and we definitely need very, very coordinated responses and stronger public-private collaboration as required for securing this critical infrastructure and systems. That's what I believe. The second point I want to make in that front is cyber risk are not by definition they are bounded by any definitions or geography. As I just said, right, we have to be global digital. So rendering public and private assets. So if some breach happens, some fraud happens in any company, it's a global company nowadays, right? If we are rendering that public information, breach data, taking somebody's credit card information from dark web, it is going to impact businesses, end users, everybody, complete economy. There is no boundary to it. And then assets become really vulnerable without any discrimination. Doesn't matter whose private data it is, right? So it's very very important to build a system which are not vulnerable, which are resilient, which has redundancy, as we just spoke about. Because if the system that we build, right, all the systems are IT systems where we do payment transaction, these are all built based on technologies. So if there is a vulnerability which is masked at the time of build of these payment systems, and if it is masked, it will creep up as a destruction, big destruction. So it's very very important to take a cybersecurity policy right from security by design, right from implementation to deployment, very seriously in this payment digitization. So that's what I would say, and I would end my comment with that.
Security by design, absolutely. And I think this is a great note to end on. Clearly, we have a very, very exciting space ahead with huge, huge challenges up ahead in terms of getting these billion users to trust what they're doing, especially when they've encountered failures and worse, maybe fraud. And I do hope we see that uptake of these multiple systems happening smoothly as we get into the newer NUEs and so on. Thank you very much, panelists, and thanks for all your inputs. I wish we could have taken up some of them in, but I'm sure we'll have space for full panels on some of the things. Thanks very much. Back to you,
Thank you
Anand.
so much. Thank you, Prasanto. Thanks, Renuka, Monica, for being great panelist with me.
Yep.
Thank you.
On behalf of DSA, I'd like to thank all of the
Thank
panelists for
you.
sparing your time and making this a very valuable, insightful session. I really enjoyed the session personally, and it was very educative as well in terms of contactless payment and how the ecosystem is growing and how we can secure it. Again, thank you so much for your valuable time and contribution. And for the audience, please go have your lunch break. We'll be resuming session at 2:15 now. Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.